All right, next up, I'm super excited. You guys got to a tiny piece of how awesome Bryan is at the rally, but he's going to come up and share some more of his testimony and why he does what he does with you guys. Again, Bryan, he's the founder of Stand True Pro-Life Ministry, which is back there. You can learn out more about him, and also the youth outreach coordinator for Priest for Life. Give it up for Bryan Kemper.
You know, it's awesome to see these student groups up here. Back in the day, way back when I remember meeting Kristen Hawkins when she was just this young whippersnapper, taking over what was then called American Collegians for Life. And I used to speak at their rallies, and to see what God has done through Kristen and through all of the people at Students for Life America is absolutely amazing. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my history in the pro-life movement, I guess, and how I got to what I'm doing, because I don't come from a good Christian family at all. I actually was born, my mom was not married. I had a disease called spinal meningitis when I was born. I was actually pronounced clinically dead, brought back to life. I went through a really hellish childhood. I was beaten, abused, molested. I went through a lot of hard times as a child. And there was no God, there was no love in my family in those days. And I ended up living on the streets. I dropped out of school. I was a drug addict. I was involved in so many evil things that I wouldn't even bring up in here. And in 1987, I overdosed and almost died at a Grateful Dead Bob Dylan concert in Anaheim, California. And it was a doctor in the hospital who shared Christ with me and told me that I had value and that I was loved and that I was worth something. And it blew my mind at the time, because nobody in my life had ever told me that I had value until that doctor. And then the next day, actually, when I got out of the hospital, I was swimming. I went to the ocean to swim, to kind of calm down and come out of what I was doing. And I was in the harbor, and a boat in the harbor came up to me, and the guy in the boat was like, "You were at the Grateful Dead concert in Anaheim." And I'm like, "How do you know that?" And he goes, "I'm the fireman that put you in the ambulance." And then he shared Christ with me. And it was just like such an amazing thing that God was doing. And so that week, I went back home and I started to get high again. And I just started bawling my eyes out and had no idea why I was crying. And I reached in my pocket, and there was a phone number the doctor had given me. And I called it, and it was a church. And I just said, "Listen, I'm on drugs. I'm going to die. Can you help me?" And the pastor of the church said, "Come on down." So the next day I went to this church, and he's like, "We're going to give you a place to live. We're going to help you get sober. We're going to take care of all your needs. The only thing we ask is you do one thing." And I was like, "What?" He says, "Just give God a chance. Can you just give God a chance?" And I kind of looked up. I was like, "All right, God, I've tried everything else. Let's see what you can do." It's a very dangerous thing to say to God. And I was there for about 3 days, and I hated it. Absolutely hated being there. And I started going through withdrawals, and they came in and they prayed over me. And all of a sudden that night when they prayed over me, when I was going through the withdrawals, like everything in my body just stopped. Like all of a sudden the withdrawals stopped, but I also felt like 1,000 pounds was lifted off of my chest. And I fell into the most peaceful sleep I'd ever had in my life. And I basically woke up the next morning just absolutely in love with Jesus. I'm like, "Tell me about Jesus. This is so..." And I just sat down and I read the Gospel of John from front to back and just fell in love with God, and have given my life to Christ on that day back in 1987. And have never gone back. So, yeah, you can applaud for that. Now, I was really into music back then. I was really into music, really into punk rock and hardcore and all that stuff. And I was like, I remember going to the church the first day and was like, "Okay, so like, are there any good Christian rock bands?" And somebody handed me a tape, Amy Grant. And I'm just like, wow. And I was just like, "Is this the best we have?" I'm like, "Come on." And then someone handed me this tape of this band. It was called The Crucified. And this was one of the original Christian punk bands back in the 80s. And they said, "Hey, this band's playing at the church this weekend." I'm like, "Really? This is awesome." So I went to this show, and it was 4 bands: Cross, Vengeance, Deliverance, and The Crucified. And I remember there's this mosh pit going on, and people are going nuts. And I'm like, this is absolutely insane. Like, people would fall down, and everybody would stop and pick them up and help them. I'm like, that's not what I'm used to at all. but this is cool. And I remember the band, there was a table in the back, and the band's shirt just said Gal 220. And I walked up, I'm like, who's this Gal 220? They're like, no, that's Galatians 220. And he's like, for I have been crucified with Christ, I no longer live, but Christ lives within me. And I'm like, whoa, that's how I feel. And then the band started, and the singer, Mark Solomon, he's up there, and he starts singing this song called The Silent Scream. And I walked up to the table again, and it was his girlfriend. Now it's his wife, and they're still good friends of mine. Back then, they were in high school, and it was his girlfriend, and she started telling me about this thing called abortion. And I remember, I knew a little bit, I remember one of my friends once asked me for money for an abortion, and I said, I don't want to do that. But she started telling me what's going on. And I walked around that for like weeks just listening to this cassette tape back on my remember the Walkman? Anybody here remember a Walkman? Oh yeah, old people. Exactly. So I have my Walkman, but you know what? They're going to come back. They're going to be retro again. Like in 10 years, people are going to have Walkmans again. So I had my Walkman. I was listening to this Silent Scream, and I was thinking about this. And then my friend would give me a ride to church all the time, and she started telling me about this thing called Operation Rescue and how they would go and they would pray and they would sit down and they would just lay their lives down for the sake of the children in front of the abortion mills, and they would just peacefully pray and cry out to God. And people would be arrested, but they would end up closing abortion clinics down for hours at a time. And thousands of women were changing their mind because they couldn't get in, and the sidewalk counselors were talking to them, and babies were saved. And I was like, wow, this is kind of cool. And so I went to one of these rescues one time, and I saw there was like 500 pro-abortion activists in the streets of downtown Los Angeles screaming in people's faces. And all the pro-lifers are just there praying. I mean, if you ever hear this thing about violence, I mean, the pro-lifers are literally just kneeling and praying and crying, and the pro-abort people were just screaming in their face. But I had a mohawk and everything, and they thought I was one of them. And they said, dude, we need you to help guard the door. I'm like, okay. Yeah. Needless to say, I got beat up a little after they found out who I was and stopped the door. But I was like, this is awesome. I want to get involved in this passion. Like, this is awesome. I want to do more to save lives. And I had worked at this oil change place, and I called my boss. I said, hey, I can't work on weekends anymore. I'm going to save babies. And he's like, I'm like, you either fire me or keep me, but I'm not doing this anymore. And so every weekend I spent time going to the abortion mills and praying and sidewalk counseling. And back then we used to do this thing long before Lila Rose. I love Lila Rose, but we used to do this way back in the day before we even had like cameras, because video cameras back then were like, big giant things. But we would go undercover and do what we called a truth team. And this is, I want you guys to understand how evil the abortion industry is. The girl that I used to go in a truth team with, she was about 14 years old. I was in my 20s. Her parents and I were good friends. She looked 14. I looked in my 20s. So if I walk in with this 14-year-old saying, hey, my girlfriend's pregnant, what's the first thing they should have done? Call the police. Never once. Now, this girl was she had never even kissed a boy in her whole life. A virgin, never kissed a boy in her life. 2 separate occasions. The abortionist walked out after the pregnancy test and said, yes, you're pregnant. She was a virgin. 2 times he said, yes, you're pregnant. Give us $250. We'll do the abortion right now. We won't report you. What that would have been was basically rape. That's what that would have been if they would have performed a medical procedure on this girl who was a virgin. So imagine how many young women went into those abortion mills that weren't really pregnant and were told they were. That's what this abortion industry is. This is the war on women. These are the people that hate women, that would do that to women. So this is one day, and I see, when I got involved, I said I wanted to be a rock star. I was going to start this band and go off and like preach the gospel and save the world. So I said I'm going to do 1 year of pro-life work, then I can say I've done my part and move on with my life. So one day we went into this abortion mill, and we were undercover, and I was with a different girl, my friend Kathy, and Kathy went in, and what we used to do is she would go ask for a pregnancy test, and I would sit in the lobby, and I would hold the magazines, and then I would like take literature out of my pocket and put it in the magazine, and then put the magazine back on the rack, and take the next magazine, and totally just do all this. And I would have fetal models, and I'd leave them on the chairs in the waiting room. And it was like this was way before all the laws and stuff. Now you can't do that because of the federal laws and stuff. But we would do this. And this one day, we went into this abortion mill in downtown Los Angeles. And on the way in, this is an abortion mill that was specifically geared towards illegal immigrants. And they were literally passing out coupons on the corner for $40 off an abortion in Spanish. So we go into this abortion mill. She goes in, and she's taking a long time. And I'm thinking, oh, my gosh, they caught her. Because she would go in the back room. You think I'm cool for doing the magazine. She's going sneaking into the abortion room and putting pro-life literature and fetal models under the pillow. And I'm thinking, oh, my gosh, she got caught. What's going on? And so I walked up to the counter to find out where she was, and this door swung open. And it was the abortion room. And I can still picture this girl's face, laying there with her legs in the air as the abortionist was killing her baby. And I looked and I saw tears pouring out of her eyes. And I saw an innocent child killed right in front of me. And a young girl, probably emotionally damaged for the rest of her life. And I realized at that moment, this is not just an issue. This is life and death. And I went home that night, and I just crying out to God in the shower. The shower is a great place to pray. If you got a good hot water heater, you get some good prayer time in. No distractions. And I was just crying out to God, and I heard a voice that said, Bryan, save my babies. Save the babies. And I knew from that moment on I was going to dedicate the rest of my life to ending abortion. And that was the year I started an organization called Rock for Life, which is now hooked up with Students for Life of America. Before I did Stand True, I started Rock for Life. When I first started, if we wanted to hold an event, we had to go to every Christian event in town and hand them a flyer as they were coming out. There was no such thing as posting something on Facebook. Nobody knew that there were other pro-life groups around the country. We didn't have the internet. You guys have such an advantage with social media and organizations like Students for Life of America and Stand True and Rock for Life and Live Action and Crossroads and all these groups that are out there. And amazing state groups like Oregon Right to Life that are investing in this generation. But what you have to understand, what I want you to understand today, one, we cannot do this without God. I truly believe that. We cannot do this. Nothing in my life matters but by the blood of Christ. Nothing. And I believe that this generation, like you guys just said, is the pro-life generation. I'm 47 years old. I'm an old fart. I've been doing this for 20-something years. I beg you, put me out of a job. Put me out of a job. And don't allow my children to have to come and stand on this stage in 20 years to talk to your children. My generation failed you. We have. And I'm sorry. I spent so many years so apathetic about this. So many years not even caring. And I'm sorry that my generation has handed you this legacy. Don't hand this to your children. Do not allow us to say 80 years. It's time that we stand up and, like they've said, directly, compassionately, and in love, put an end to child killing. Thank you. God bless you.